Thank you so much to Squarespace, as always, for continuing to support my art channel. Welcome to my art studio, and as you can see, my plants are not doing so well, but hopefully they will come back in the springtime when it's less dry in here. So I'm back with the follow-up video that I promised from the last one. So the last video was about doing structural studies, and this one is going to be about doing tonal studies slash warm-ups. So like I mentioned in my last video, typically this is something that I do before I get to my comic work, and I do these studies for about half an hour to an hour. Usually an hour is what it takes for me to properly get warmed up, and while I get warmed up I typically pick something to study, and in this case it is tonal studies, I guess. So this is actually a pretty good follow-up to the last video, because the step of putting tones down and shading the portraits is essentially the step after doing a structural study like the ones that I showed you last time. So my approach with these is just slightly different. As you can see, I obviously leave out any sort of tonal area fills at all until I'm ready to fully commit to the shading step. So in this video, I'm just going to show you a couple of sped up studies so you can just get a quick look at a glance at how I go about doing these things. And then I have one real-time recording that I will just go over exactly what choices I make, what I would do differently, if there's anything that goes wrong, etc. So yeah. Also, again, I'm doing these studies from screen caps from Arcane, which you can watch on Netflix. If you've never heard of it, it is an animated show based on League of Legends. Anyways, so one of the biggest reasons why I started doing these tonal studies is because in my comic, I have changed up my shading approach a little bit since my days working on Grimoire Noir, which is the graphic novel that I illustrated like several years ago. So because I'm basically going back to comics full-time now for the most part, I want to tweak the step of shading for myself and make it better. Like essentially I just want to improve upon my work from last time. And one of the ways in which I decided to do that was to just do these studies and to figure out how to rely less on blending tools. So for that reason, when I do these studies, I use the Lasso tool a lot, and for the most part I try to complete the full tonal study without using any soft brushes or blending tools. So I mean, I'm not like super extreme about this stuff, so sometimes I'll use a little bit, but overall the goal is to just practice shading with shapes and the Lasso tool without reliance on blending and softening brushes or like tools. So yeah, and this helps a lot because I think it is much faster to do a quick angular shape-based pass of shading before using any sort of blending where necessary, and that's the step where I think it will save me a lot of time in my comic. And if you compare these studies to the way that I shade my comic, they are a little more detailed, because obviously with comic pages, I mean, there's only so much effort you can put into each panel before it becomes like completely redundant. But I still think doing more detailed and focused studies like this will still help me greatly improve in the skill. And for the most part right now, I've only really done black and white tonal studies, but actually in the future I am planning to graduate to doing some color studies as well. So, and actually my plan for doing color studies in the future, I should mention, is going to be to mimic the type of layer structure that I use for my comics. So it's not going to be just like single layer painting, just color picking. First of all, I don't even color pick because I think that kind of robs you from learning what you could. And I will be approaching it in the same super layered type of way that I do my comic. But anyways, getting ahead of myself. I'm gonna probably do that like in a month or so once I've done a good amount of these black and white studies. So I think I've pretty much gone over all the uses of these. And as far as the brushes go, I know sometimes people ask what brushes I use. I'm only using 2 brushes here. One of them is the Ultimate 2B or Ultimate HB or something pencil from Kyle's Megapack. You can kind of actually see all the brushes on the side over here of the window. And for shading, I used this brush. It's from Ahmed Aldoori's brush pack. I think I modified it a little bit, but it's just like a sketch brush. I just blow it up because it has a really nice texture, and I really like the look of texture. And when I work digitally, I can't stand like super smooth brushes, so I really gravitate towards all the texture brushes. And that's about it as far as the brushes go. And so we're kind of approaching the end of this study over here, and then the next one will be real time, in which I will just go over like every single step with more detail. But for this one, like in my last video, I mentioned that I try to avoid using free transform, but you know what? Sometimes you just gotta do it. So for this one, I had to move things around at some point, like midway through the drawing, because I was kind of leaning on an angle. I have this really big CINTIQ monitor, and sometimes it's kind of hard to see exactly what I'm doing, but I think I managed to pull it together near the end where it's sort of close. But that one I did after this first Caitlin one. So before I continue, I'm just going to take a quick minute to tell you about today's sponsor, Squarespace. As an independent artist, I have to juggle a lot of different things and jobs, and a portfolio website upkeep isn't something I can spend a whole lot of time on, which is why I really like using Squarespace. Once the initial setup is done, maintenance is super quick. So every time I have something to add to my portfolio, uploading an image and rearranging my gallery to look good only takes a couple of minutes. The automatic image scaling feature makes the gallery neat very quickly, and I can always go into the design settings to adjust the thumbnail sizes to my liking or change it to slideshow mode if I feel like it. Squarespace has multiple modes of editing pages as well, which makes it very versatile, so you can just add a block of text or an image or move things around intuitively without any need for custom codes. If you want to start building your own website, head over to squarespace.com and get started right away for free. You can play around and see how easy it is to make a professional looking website for yourself. Once you put together your website and are ready to launch, you can go to squarespace.com/cosmicspectrumart and get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. And now back to the video. It's a little bit backwards, the order here, but I picked this one to talk about because it is a bit shorter. Like Jinx, the previous study took me about 30 minutes altogether, just because I was fixing some stuff and I really got into the little details. But with this one, it was a little faster. So this one took about 20 minutes and basically the same amount of time as my typical structural portrait studies, which take like 10 minutes to just get the face down, and then afterwards probably takes about 10 minutes to put the tonals down, like to put the tones down. So for this one, of course, as usual, like I always tell you guys, slow wins the race. So I try to go as slow as I can in the beginning to just put down the facial features. And actually, I want to point out here that I kind of misplaced the nose right off the bat, and that's probably because I told you, I usually do eyebrows first and then nose and then mouth, kind of shape of the face, and then go back to the eyes. But in this particular case, I think if I actually put the eyes in first, I would have noticed that the nose is not exactly in the right place. So then, I don't know, I kind of noticed this like way later in the process, and I was kind of too lazy to fix it. I think it would have been actually pretty easy to fix if I just moved the eyes down a little bit and like a few pixels over. So that would have been a good time to use the free transform tool, but I did not. And so the angle of the face is a bit off, but in any case, it is predominantly a tonal study anyways. But next time, I always just strive to like pay more attention, and it can be hard for me to do these types of angles that are slightly from below, so that's like one of those really challenging ones for me personally, as far as facial angles go. But anyways, yes, so I basically just continue to put down very light lines to indicate the collar, like a bit of the clothing. I decided not to linger too much on these details because for the most part, the face is where I want to focus, because my goal is to just get better at shading faces, better and faster, and to have a better understanding of facial structure. And I think these types of tonal studies really help with understanding facial structure. Alright, so I just decided to skip a little bit of the initial sketch and structural lines footage, because I already kind of explained how I do that in my previous video, and in this one I mostly just wanted to focus on the shading and tonal study. So I decided to take this one to the next level slightly, because there are a bunch of tonal studies I did previously that were quick, where I did not put down a base tone, and I just kind of put the shadows down and made it approximate, and that made the images look a little bit blown out, like if the contrast was really high. But for this one, since it's a slightly darkly lit scene, I figured I will just go ahead and try to replicate it more closely to the source material. And I decided to start with a quick background solid color, because sometimes trying to do a tonal study out of context, like by out of context I mean the context of the background and the scene, it can be difficult to pick the right tones or even colors if you're doing it in color, because the contrast is too stark between the white background and the character. So it does help to have a background at least filled with a similar tone to what it is in the original image, to help your eye adjust to the contrast and to be able to pick the tones or the colors better. So that's like a more informed way of doing these things, less lazy, gives a bit more accurate results. So I did that, and what you see me doing right now is just like selecting the shape of the hair, just fill it in quickly because it has very little detail in it anyway. So I decided to get that shape out of the way first to bring out the shape of the face, and then just focus on the face afterwards. So here I'm just about to bring back the background and just to delete some of these overlapping parts so I can just focus on the face. And I think this helped quite a bit to just like figure out what my tonal base tone will be for the face. And so typically when I do these studies, I don't mess around too much with brush settings, but when I want to get a little bit more detail and approach it in a little bit more of a focused way, like I'm doing here, I sometimes change the opacity. So I just work with black, and when I choose not to change the opacity, like right now it's still at 100%, I just kind of work with pressure. So if I press really lightly, it's going to be lighter, and if I press harder, it'll be darker. So I will utilize that wherever I can, but sometimes it is tough to get those lighter tones to be even when you need to sustain a super light pressure. And for that reason, sometimes it just makes way more sense to go up into the settings and to just set a lower opacity for the brush, which is what I did here for the base tone of her face. And as you can see, I'm just kind of deleting the eyes. And I don't even know if that was super necessary. I think the whites of her eyes are just maybe ever so slightly lighter than the base tone of the skin. So maybe I could have just gone over the whole thing with this brush without having to select them out. But in any case, later that can always be dealt with. So that's maybe something that I would have done differently if I were to do this again. So like I mentioned before, when I do the structural study with just the lines, I tend to indicate as much information as I possibly can with the planes of the face, and just trying to indicate like every little part crease of the eyes and whatnot. And yeah, because I did no shading whatsoever in the sketch, I didn't even bother darkening like the really dark parts, and I think it kind of pays to just wait to do that later. So I'm basically just working exclusively with the lasso selection, like freehand lasso selection tool, where I just manually select the shape of every single element that I'm working with so that I can fill it in all at once. And this is such a great technique. It's super fast. It's easy to get a gradient in there by just using your pressure. And so like I don't even like, I suppose I could use a gradient, the gradient tool where appropriate, and I do actually utilize the gradient tool quite a bit in my comic. But here with these studies, like the one thing that I lament about the gradient tool is that you can't set the gradient to have a texture, so it's just gonna be super smooth. And like I mentioned, I'm not a huge fan of the super polished and smooth digital look, so for that reason I just kind of try to mimic a gradient with the motions of my hand by just, you know, loosening the pressure over in some of these parts, and that tends to work actually relatively well. So I would say definitely try it if you really rely on the gradient tool a lot, but I digress. So I tend to just work all over the place. I don't always fill in the very darks first. In this particular case, I decided to do that first, so I filled in the eyelashes, eyebrows, and just like the nostrils, because those were the darkest spots on the face. And then afterwards I picked the next tone and just kind of locally working with the eyes and nose area, and I decided to leave the lips for a little bit later. And so at this point it is relatively meticulous, but the whole point of the exercise is to try to find the shapes for all the shadows in a way that I can just select one shape and fill it in, and slowly the image will come together, and I don't have to blend anything at any point or change my brush or do anything like that. And I do believe that at this point I did go back to 100% opacity. I think I can't really see on the video here because I'm obviously recording post completion, but yes, it's probably like 100% opacity, and I'm just solely relying on the pressure, and I'm slowly filling in all these little details. And sometimes it helps to, like, if you see an area, like for instance under the lips, I will sometimes make like just multiple selections. So I'll select a bigger area, fill it in with the lighter color, and then select a smaller area that is more precise within the same shape to go over it one more time. Because of course when using a brush like this and using pressure and just controlling the pressure with obviously my hand, if you go over the same area one more time, it will overlay and it will create like a darker overlap, and of course that can be used to your advantage if necessary. So that also helps with layering essentially. And it does get slightly tedious, but I do find this process to be super satisfying because you can really see how every single shadow shape helps so much with the definition of the face and to really just bring out the three-dimensional aspect of it, especially after the initial sketch looks very flat by comparison. And it is really cool to see how much you can accomplish by just selecting solid shapes and filling them in. So yeah, I think it's a really good practice. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm not really against using blending tools or anything, but I think doing it this way, approaching it this way, where I really have to force my brain to see the shapes and to be able to select them accurately to get the same impression, I think that really helps me to understand how the planes of the face work and to just like get better at shape selection essentially. So as you can see, this is like nearing the end, and yeah, at this point it's like super evident that the nose is just sitting a little bit too low, and yeah, it's fine. I mean, it's not like the end of the world. Definitely something I noticed later on, but there's really no point in trying to fix something like that, because I don't know, it's just a waste of time. Something to just pay attention for me later on when I tackle similar types of angles. And when I finished the face, for the most part, I decided to just add just a little bit of detail, because at this point I'm sort of invested in the image as it is, and just to add some sort of detail below the face so it's not just stark white, I'm just selecting some random shapes and making it a little bit more abstract. Like, I'm by no means trying to reference and copy like exactly what's going on there. So sometimes it's nice to practice to just add a little bit of abstractions just to fill the space and to create a more complete looking image, without like meticulously mulling over every single detail and trying to replicate it. Because this is actually one of the issues that I used to have, one of the major issues that I used to have, and I'm still kind of battling more or less sometimes, is with distribution of details. Because what makes an image really appealing a lot of the time is not necessarily its level of details like spread all over the place evenly, or just how crazy detailed it is, but it's more about the contrast between areas where there's more detail and areas where there's less, so that it's just more interesting to look at. And I personally really gravitate towards that type of art. So yes, just thought I'd mention that. And yeah, I think at this point this is pretty much done. I'm just putting in a little bit of extra touches, and then I was looking at it and I decided that maybe I could actually select some areas and use the eraser tool to just like bring them out, pop them out a little bit. So I decided to do that. It's also something I didn't do with my previous studies, because I just did essentially like a very straightforward pencil type of look with only adding shadows but not taking anything away. But something like this would be the equivalent of just taking an eraser and then going in and like lightening some of the areas, and kind of went pretty easy on it. There really wasn't much as far as highlights go, because it's a pretty low lit scene and there's not much contrast at all. But yeah, so this was very informative for me to study, and I think I actually did learn a lot from this one. Definitely think I learned a bit more from the previous one that you saw in in sped up. And by the way, I think I sped those up by 8 or 10 times. So that was the speed. And yeah, I really would recommend doing these types of studies, especially using the Lasso tool and only relying on pressure and like a single brush. Super helpful to work with a limited tool set, even if it is digital. Like, just because you work in digital doesn't mean you need to use all the tools that are available to you, you know what I mean? It really helps to kind of reduce the process into its basic form. But yeah, that's pretty much all I have for you guys for this video, and I will see you in the next one. Thank you so much for watching, if you watched all the way to the end, and if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please consider doing so. Bye!